Welcome to the Embodiment Podcast. This show is for you if you see the body as more than a brain taxi. It's for people interested in coming home to the body as a holistic aspect of who we are and how we live. Episodes contain practical tips, exercises you can take away, and interviews with specialists from around the world. I'm your host for today, Mark Walsh. So on the show today, Norman Blair. So Norman's a pretty experienced yoga teacher. He's author of a great book full of beautiful illustrations, all about yoga, called Brightening Up My Inner Skies. Is that right, Norman?
That is, Mark. Yep.
I've seen it plenty of times. I've gone to his classes in London, restorative classes, yin classes. I've come to a couple of workshops for his. He's a regular at the Buddhafield Festival, where he's well thought of. Just an experienced yoga teacher with some interesting views on yoga. So Norman, welcome.
Thank you, Mark.
How did you get interested in the body, Norman? What was your way into this?
How did I get interested in the body? Well, I've always had a body, Mark. But probably for a long time, there was, I want to say, some kind of lack of awareness, disconnection from body. And it's been a kind of a slow process. I had a fairly kind of, I did other avenues to try and get me into the body, like taking drugs and dancing and things like that in the 1980s. And then in the early 1990s, I began slowly to get into yoga. And that became a path for me to be more, how can you call it, more body aware, more appreciative of body.
Cool. And what was the first kind of yoga you got interested in? Was there, where did you start your journey?
So I actually started it at a place called Bodywise down on Roman Road in East London. And that was in 1991. And it's a bit of a kind of cliche. I was taken along by a friend who thought it'd be good for me.
Right.
And, that was like a beginner's class. And I can't really remember much about it, apart from going up some stairs and leaving my shoes outside the door. And I did that a few times. And then I stopped. And then a couple of years later, a friend of mine was doing an Iyengar teacher training. And she needed guinea pigs as part of the training. So I was very happy to be a guinea pig for her. So we started meeting. I was going to her class and she was teaching in her living room. And there was maybe like half a dozen of us. And it was such a great environment, Mark, to learn, this small group.
Yeah.
And then her name's Oz and she's still teaching. And in the kind of, after about a year or two, she then got more increasing into Ashtanga yoga, and that's what she started teaching. So that's kind of my journey from when I was initially going along to yoga, it was just yoga. And then it's starting to develop more of a label, and I started to understand more of a particular system. And then I started at the end of the 1990s, I started going along to a self-practice, Ashtanga self-practice. But it was, this idea of practicing together in a small group, I'm really into, and you might have heard me talk about this at classes of, I sometimes call it yoga of intimacy.
Mm-hmm. And I've been in classes of yours that had, 8 people in your house in the attic. And I've been to other classes of yours, like workshops where there was 2 different rooms and 80 people or something, and it's really quite a different experience.
Yeah, I prefer working with smaller groups. And I think there's that kind of, I'm trying to think of how you might describe it, sense of belonging, and we can be more seen. It's funny, I remember talking to someone about this a year or two back, and she was like, no, I don't want to be in a small group. I want to be anonymous.
Right.
I just assumed that nearly everyone would want to be part of a small group and have that more of a kind of personal connection. But for her, the reverse was true, and she wanted to skulk in a corner. But yeah, I think, there's a thing of I sometimes call it industrial yoga.
Yep.
When there is so the classes I teach at Buddhafield, so Buddhafield is a very kind of special place for those of you who are listening who have not yet been to Buddhafield. I'd highly recommend it. And, the classes can be, you've been there, Mark, the classes can be really big, really busy.
And also it's like in a tent, maybe there's not enough equipment, it's a festival situation.
Yes. There are drummers, there might be rain, the mats are dirty, the teacher might be covered with face paint, all this kind of stuff.
Yes.
But Buddhafield's a great place. But just going, this idea of like working together in small groups, and something I'm really interested in, and I know you've got an interest in this as well, is like relationship.
Yep.
And I think, there's certainly an issue with people just dropping in and out of yoga classes. And I know in London, and I suspect there's some similarities with Brighton, people just it's like studio skipping, and they can go and get like a cheap deal at one studio for like a month.
Pass cards they have now, right?
Exactly. I really don't like the kind of, is it Groupon, ClassPass, all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I first heard about them in Poland. Someone told a few years ago, and someone told me, "Oh, this is totally undermining all the teachers' salaries and ruining the yoga and undermining a student-teacher relationship." And then it's moved to the UK now, and it seems to create a sort of consumer culture.
Yes.
This is one of the main things I'd love to talk with you about, is the sort of intersection of consumerism, capitalism, and yoga. We might.
Mark?
What's that?
Big subject.
Well, this is it. I mean, you're the man, though. Like, let's go straight in there. I mean, I heard you're looking at starting a union for yoga. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm kind of interested in how we as yoga teachers can, it's almost like be more confident in what we do and be more connected with each other, rather than having a more individualistic approach. And for too long, in my opinion, if you kind of look at the studios that you've got, on one hand, you've got the studio, and obviously the studio needs to keep going, and they need to make money, and they need to cover their costs. So that's clear. And then on the other hand, you've got the student, and the student, often wants to get cheaper yoga classes. Mm-hmm. And then on the third pole is out of the teachers. And I kind of feel that, over the last maybe 10 years, it's the teachers that have been increasingly squeezed. And I have a lot of teachers talking to me about saying, they're really exhausted, they're really burnt out. And what I'm really into is sustainability, because as teachers, we have the potential to get better and better. It's not like we're professional footballers, as an example, where we have to retire when we're 35 because we can't run as fast as we used to, or our knees are knackered. But as teachers, we can get better and better. But if the pressure is so much that people just kind of crack, and that has definitely happened to people, then those skills are lost.
So have you seen that, and if I may jump in, Norman, you've seen teachers kind of burn out and just having to, especially in London, running around trying to teach so many classes.
Yeah, absolutely, Mark.
There's not afford to do it as well, right? It's really tricky to earn a living.
Yeah, absolutely. I know teachers who teach like 20 plus classes a week, and I think that's like, wow, how on earth do you manage that? How on earth do you manage to stay present for that length of time? How on earth do you manage to deal with so many different psyches? And it's really, really difficult. And I think this is part of the conversation, to acknowledge that at times teaching yoga can be pretty tough.
Right.
And so there's that acknowledgement, and then, okay, so what can we do about it? And I think there are all these different threads, Mark, because I'm also very much into affordability of yoga and making yoga as accessible as possible to as many people as possible. But if the affordability comes at the cost of the teacher's sustainability, then what's the point?
Yeah, right. So it's got to work for everyone, hasn't it? It's got to be a win-win with the student and the teacher, and maybe with a studio if there's a third party involved.
Yeah.
Or else it's not a win for everyone. A, someone's being screwed, so it's not ethical. And B, it's not sustainable.
Yeah, I think it's about having these kind of conversations. And too often, teachers have either been too worried to raise their voices, or they feel that they're being bullied by studios into silence.
And tell us about that then, because people might not be aware of that. Like, let's say in a major city, people are paying the equivalent of 15 euros or $20 or, £15 for a class, and they see a class full of people. Like, you might have 30 people in there, you might have more in London, some classes. The mats are so close together, you can barely squeeze a sort of anorexic yogi between them, and they must be thinking, the teacher must be really raking it in here. Because all these people paying 15 quid, the teacher must be on a few £100.
So, you know, in the main studios in London, you're paid an hourly rate. So an example of an hourly rate would be like £24 an hour. And then you're paid an amount per head, which can be maybe, like I'm paid per head at one of the studios I teach at, I'm paid per head £1.40.
So you get a certain number of students and a certain amount as a set rate. Yeah. And then again, what isn't paid for is maybe the setup time or the travelling to class, right? In London, it can take you 45 minutes to get from, I don't know, Camden studio to a studio in Soho.
See, that's one of the issues, Mark, of there's a chain called More Yoga, and they're kind of, you know, there are slight differences. And I know a few teachers actually get a bit more than this, but they're kind of the standard rate is £30 for a class. But the teacher has to, there are no receptionists. So the teacher has to both open and close after the class. So actually, rather than being paid £30 for an hour, you're being paid £30 for maybe an hour and 20 at best, maybe actually an hour and a half. So then the hourly rates come down to 20. And someone might be listening to this and they think, well, that sounds really good. But there's all the extra work of being self-employed. There's the class preparation. There's all the administration of being self-employed. There's the fact that you can't teach like 8 classes a day. I just think it can be really difficult.
8 hours a day in a chilled out office or 8 hours a day. You know, I've worked 8 hours a day in a cafe or a bar, and it's hard work, but you can do it. I wouldn't dream of working 8 hours a day teaching every day, teaching embodiment. Now, there are intensives I do where I work 12 hours a day, but that is not sustainable. And even then, I've got colleagues. I'm not really 12 hours a day in front of the class. Like a yoga teacher should, you know, is working the whole class.
So I actually got this from you, Mark, I remember when you came here to do a course and you talked about the multi-teacher model. And I've used that word. I think it's a great description. So on the courses that I run, there are maybe 4 sessions led by other teachers. Yeah. And I'm still, as part of the course, I'm sitting in. But I think there's this point about working more together, about collaboration, about being more cooperative with each other, and also not taking all the burdens of teaching onto our own shoulders.
What do you mean, the burdens of teaching? So you mean spreading it out, so there's guest trainers, so there's different genders, so there's different perspectives, so the teachers don't get brainwashed by the one single guru kind of thing, right?
Exactly. So, you know, I'm very much into a more kind of egalitarian model. And one of the reasons that I have other people come in to teach on the courses is to clearly indicate it's not like my way or the highway, that there are different ways of doing this. There are different voices, different approaches, so that people get more of a sense of like, it's more of a kind of, I want to call it like a critical consciousness, a more kind of, so you're actually being like empowered. There's a kind of a more thoughtful approach rather than kind of like the teacher knows best model, where it's kind of being imposed. This is the way to do it. A friend of mine went along to this workshop maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and it was called traditional yoga. And he said afterwards, he told me, he said, the definition of traditional yoga was that you were not allowed to ask any questions. So my version is untraditional yoga. I think, you know, questioning is really important. And I'm much more into the kind of roles of like facilitating, and people will come along on courses who know far more about many things than I do. So it's not about, oh, I know everything. Absolutely not. So getting other people to come in and teach is a way of demonstrating that.
Yeah, this is a paradigm shift away from the guru model, which is sort of the model we kind of have in schools, actually in secondary school anyway, you know, in the West, but also this Eastern guru model of this one person that knows best. And obviously yoga adds this sort of spiritual element to that. You know, no one suggests to a school child that doing what they're told is a sort of spiritual surrender, you know. They just kind of put up with it, you know, until they're on the other side of it. And so it's sophisticated in yoga to be sort of saying, right, I'm a facilitator, and there's different points of view, and you know, I've seen that can go kind of almost too far into this sort of postmodern swamp that denies experience. You know, you have a lot of experience teaching in yoga, for example, Norman. It'd be a bit crazy not to listen to that experience if I was in your yin class, right?
And you know, it's also, but there are all the other threads. Like, I've got a lot of experience with psychotherapy. And, this is something that I think is really important for people who are teaching, of getting support from other people. So I see a supervisor every couple of months. I run mentoring groups. And although personally, in some ways, I'm not in favor of regulation, I think it's a real mistake that yoga teachers get this incredibly basic training, like 200 hours, which, honestly is very, very little. You get a 200-hour training, and then essentially you're kind of kicked out of the nest, and it's sink or swim time. And I personally think that we can all benefit from, whether you call it mentoring, whether it's like supervision, or just simply support. Because when we're with someone else, we can like knock out ideas around, or we can say, and like Mark, we all make mistakes. Like I was teaching on Saturday, and I said something, and I was like, oh God, why did I say that?
Yeah.
And I kind of just got carried away. And, as you know, I can chat. And I was like, oh no, I shouldn't have said that. So we all make mistakes. We're human beings. But it's like, it can be so helpful to have someone else who's got, as you said, who's got more experience, just to kind of knock things around with.
Yeah. I mean, I just got off the phone to a therapist now, and I find that very helpful to talk to a therapist every week or two. And then mentors, I think, are something slightly different. There's this sort of cleaning up my own act therapeutically. And if we look at all these sort of abuse cases and things, I wonder how many of them had a therapist. I'm pretty sure Bikram wasn't in therapy regularly.
I would bet everything I have in the entire world that Bikram was on.
I would bet, I would definitely bet 100 quid. But no, I'm pretty sure that he wasn't. And I bet he didn't have an ongoing relationship with a mentor. Like there's a guy, Paul Linden, that I sometimes call, and sometimes he just phones me up. I just had a book launch party, and he just phoned me up to encourage me. But other times I phone him up, and I'm like, hey, there's this ethical issue. This is whatever's come up, and it's very helpful to have both a therapist to do the inner work with, and a mentor to talk through kind of issues that are specific to your industry with.
Yeah, one of the things I found interesting about Bikram was, in my understanding, that when he first came to the to North American, I think something like the early 60s, he had this practice that he really believed in, and he thought could be very helpful for many people, and he was determined to kind of spread the word. And over time, it's like he got more and more isolated, and there would be other teachers who would be as experienced or getting as experienced as he was. And Bikram would consciously push them away. I think because we can also talk about peer groups. I think peer groups can be very important. And I'm sure you might have seen this sometimes, Mark, of like, you kind of see someone who's teaching, and obviously it can be teaching in different environments. And I look at someone who's teaching, I'm like, wow, how did you manage to get your head through the door? And it's like, but things like peer groups, things like, this mentor you mentioned, are ways of keeping our feet on the floor. Because when there's that kind of, it's almost like the devotion from people.
Yeah.
And that can be very addictive. It's like, wow, I'm being devoted.
Right. And another thing is that religious quality that comes into yoga, whether you ask for it or not.
Yeah.
People hear yoga, that comes in martial arts as something similar, but not entirely the same, but similar. I had a book launch party where I was surrounded by people telling me I was amazing. And then the next day I had a family dinner, and it was so grounding. I was sitting there with my cousin taking the piss out of me, and my auntie reminding me of something that happened when I was 7 years old, And I just thought, this is the perfect thing to have happen after a book launch party.
A good contrast, Mark.
It was super helpful. And those three things, I'm glad you added peer group, because I think therapy isn't the same as a mentor, and that isn't the same as peer group. And then I might add to that something about actual rules and guidelines. Like, if it's not very cool, it's not very rebellious, but there's something about being actually part of an organization that has structures, systems, grievance procedures. We have this in our organization. If someone wants to make a complaint about me, there's people they can take it to. There's people that can outvote me on things. There's structures and systems and rules. There's an ethics policy that's in place around, say, relations with students that is in my organization, and that's above and beyond me as an individual. So it takes the pressure off me and my psychology to have that. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, because you've got a structure there, and also you can, when it's written down, you can give to students.
Right. You say, here's the deal here.
This is what you expect from a teacher.
Yeah.
So if the teacher is like abusive to you, if the teacher hurts you, then you're like, actually, this should not be happening, because it's definitely happened a lot in the past. But people almost thought, oh no, the teacher, coming back to this idea, the teacher knows best.
Right. Well, as soon as the point of view becomes it's the teacher's word that's final, then the student just questions themselves, and the other students tell them to shut up. Particularly if they're junior, if you have to be powerful to question, by the time you get powerful, you can't question because you've been brainwashed. I mean, Bikram, let's assume that he started out as a pretty decent guy who kind of just wanted to put this thing forward that he believed in. What would have been the thing to put in place for someone like that? What would have been the thing before the rot really set in and the power corrupted, as it were? What could he have done differently?
So, well, you said it, Mark. It's like his support. What support was he getting? And from my understanding, he was getting very little support from people on the same level as he was. So it's like psychotherapy, it's like mentor, it's like peer group. And these aren't either or. It's not like, either I see a psychotherapist or I'm involved in a peer group. It's all of them. So you've got that. And it's
combination is the important thing, isn't it? The peers, therapy, mentor, and the organizational sort of structures and systems. That's
a challenge, say, just with a peer group, is that it's like you can't expect a friend to be your therapist because the friend has got an emotional investment in you.
Right. They're not going to shadow work.
Do something that's unskillful. And a good friend of mine sees that, but they don't want to kind of damage the friendship. So maybe they don't say something. So sometimes we need the kind of outside expert to kind of wield the sword of truth.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, with Bikram, it's like, where were the people who were around him? What was their relationship to Bikram? And as I mentioned, my understanding is that Bikram would consciously push people away who were coming up to that kind of a level of experience or were having a lot of confidence in their own teaching. And he wouldn't want people like that around him.
Right.
And that's one of the things I would suggest of like looking around at teachers. So if you see a teacher behaving in that manner, to me, that's a warning sign.
Right. And also to go up to teacher and say, what's your ethical policy on X? Also another one I've seen is have you done your own trauma healing?
Yes.
Like, I'm seeing a lot of teachers who are acting out of their own trauma. And I
think we all are to a greater or lesser extent, Mark.
Right. How it's not do you have trauma? It's how much trauma you have and how cleaned up have you got it, which is never complete. Like I'm seeing things now and going, oh, that's a trauma. Oh, that's what I'm doing. And it just seems to be like almost should be mandatory. But it's interesting because we talked about two subjects. We talked about the abuse of teachers, but we've also, we started with the abuse of teachers, right? Yeah. This like, financial abuse and having to work for not much money. And it's like, we sort of talk about two sides of the same thing in a way.
This is one of the points that I think is important, that is almost like, on one hand, there's the guru model. On the other hand, there's the kind of the studio model, but they're about power.
Right.
And they're about keeping people in their place, whether it's as the obedient student or whether it's as the docile teacher. And to me, what's important is about empowering.
So, especially union idea, I'm jumping around a bit here, but the union idea a bit here. I mean, it seems to me that the yoga market has been undercut by lots and lots of teacher trainings. So there's lots of people willing to work for free or very little because they want to get the experience, and maybe they've got a partner who's supporting them, or maybe they're just young and don't have many overheads.
Can I just a kind of practical example, Mark?
Yeah.
When I bought my first house, which was in 1997, with my partner.
Yeah,
£72,000 in North London.
Right. Yeah, you wouldn't get.
What would 72 grand get you these days? It would get you nothing. So I've been very fortunate. I've been very lucky, and it's something like that makes such a difference. Whether I bought the house at the right time, or whether someone's got a wealthy partner, or whether someone's come out of a job that paid really well, so they have savings that can keep them going while they're earning very little. Different situations. But that's one of the oddities about this, in that within yoga there can be the talk about, say, inclusivity or being diversity. Yet at the same time, the way the yoga model can be experienced is about exclusivity. Because the people who are teaching, some of them, many of them, come from particular places.
I've definitely seen that, and I've seen it less about, say, skin color and far more about the fact they had a nice job in the city beforehand, which meant that they had money to invest, or that they had a partner who had that situation. Like, this is definitely something that I've seen in the yoga world, is a certain class of people. Class seems to be the one that's never talked about in these topics.
Yeah, I'm from a middle class background. I've got the privilege of having a good education. There are many things there.
What do you think's a blind spot for the yoga world generally now? Because I think the sort of stuff around abuse is really coming to the fore. Like Matthew Remski and other people have done good stuff on that. And I think the stuff around trauma is since I first flagged it years ago, it's really come a long way. Like, I'm really impressed with the, yoga. Let's give yoga some credit. It's become much more trauma sensitive than it was. What do you think is a current blind spot? Because I always get the sense that you're fairly leading edge on things.
I suppose it's coming back to, how do we look after the teachers? Sustainability is about, too often people paint a face on. I call it like the new age smile. And everything's okay. I'm doing well. I'm teaching yoga. Isn't this great? But behind the smile, they're like some duck paddling frantically to stay afloat.
Right.
So there's a kind of, there's a pretense. There's a delusion that it's okay.
Right.
And for some people, it's not okay. Some people do find it really hard. But there's that kind of fear of publicly talking about it, which then makes, that whole thing of like the secret, the suppression, that makes it even more problematic.
Right. So it's yoga teachers feeling they have to sort of plaster on that smile almost, isn't it, as well? Because there's a shame in admitting you've got a problem. There's a shame in saying, hey, you're teaching a class, you should be grateful, kind of thing,
And also, when you go in to teach a class, there's that sense of like, well, this is a great privilege.
There's truth in that. There's truth in that, for sure.
Yeah, I'm so privileged to be in this place of being able to. So many people, Mark, are so fed up with their work, are so fed up with their lives.
Yeah, I'd rather be an underpaid yoga teacher than a well-paid office worker. There's truth in that.
Yeah, definitely. So it's to recognize that privilege, but then there's this kind of, it's almost like some kind of schizophrenia there, isn't there? That there is this great privilege, but at the same time, for some people, there's a real struggle. And obviously, when you're teaching a class, you can't, you need to have proper boundaries. You can't just dump all your stuff out on the class. That would be wrong. But still, there's that kind of feeling of, oh God, I'm teaching this class and people are looking at me and thinking, wow, isn't this great? He's a yoga teacher or she's a yoga teacher. But actually inside, that person might be, as I said, paddling frantically to stay afloat.
You're right. It's not a contradiction, but I think there's a sort of line here, isn't there? We have to say, look, this could seem like a very first world problem. Oh, poor yoga teacher doesn't get paid enough, and then it's like, but equally there's a gratitude for like, hey, I love teaching, in my case, embodiment, like yoga for you. I really feel privileged to do this, and I want this to be sustainable, and my kindness needs to include myself. Yes. And this is, it's interesting. Like when I teach a lot of yoga teachers embodiment, and when I ask them, what do you care about? They say health, spirituality, the environment, their families, their sex lives. What they never say is making money or a job. It's like a huge...
Never say never, Mark.
I personally have very rarely heard that. Let me be accurate. I very rarely have heard that in hundreds of classes asking. And it's very rare that anyone says that who's coming from a yoga background. So my conclusion hearing that, given that it's such a normal part of life, is that there's a kind of a shadow there around this whole topic of money, like somehow it's not spiritual to talk about it, whether that be in the sense of, hey, I want to improve my marketing, or in the sense of, hey, I want to get paid a fair wage.
Yeah, it's to some extent, it's like a taboo subject.
Uh-huh.
So one of the things I've been aspiring towards this year is trying to break that taboo of like, let's talk honestly about it. Let's have transparency with how much people are being paid, with how much studios are paying teachers, with how much did you spend on those Lululemon leggings, as an example. Because
right.
one of the aspects of the whole kind of, I really don't like using the word yoga industry, but of the whole yoga industry, like the legging manufacturers, like Lululemon, are making a lot of money. The software, what do you call them? The platforms like Mind Body Online are making a lot of money.
Uh-huh.
But in a way, what you might describe as the wealth creators, which is the yoga teachers, are getting squeezed.
Because
the studios have the power, because the teachers are individualized, because people would rather spend like 150 quid on a pair of Lululemon leggings and then go off to a studio and try and get as cheap a possible deal as they can on the classes.
You know, it's quite strange.
One of the things I'm interested in, Mark, is I kind of see what I sometimes call the devaluing of yoga. So, you know, there will be places that offer very, very cheap classes. And I talked earlier about this kind of studio skipping. So there's this kind of devaluing of yoga, and that also includes what yoga teachers are being paid and what yoga teachers expect to be paid. So this devaluing of yoga, and I want to kind of, it's almost like revalue, because this is a really beautiful practice that's had a profound influence on me, had a profound influence on many other people. And I don't want it to be devalued. I want us to recognize how profound what we're doing can be.
That's lovely. Yeah, maybe I just want to pause and take a breath there for a minute. Things could put into pause.
Quick interruption to tell you about my book, Embodiment. Creatively named, hey? Actually, Embodiment Moving Beyond Mindfulness. You can find this online at theembodimentbook.com. That's theembodimentbook.com. So this book is an introduction to the whole field. If you like these interviews, you'll probably love this book. Funny stuff, poems, personal stories from my life, illustrating what embodiment's all about, and loads for professionals in the field too. Top teaching tips, language tips, that kind of thing. Yeah, a real condensation of everything I've learned about embodiment, basically. So you can get pre-orders at Amazon.com, and if you just put in Embodiment Moving Beyond Mindfulness, that's the name of the book, or go to theembodimentbook.com. On there, you'll see quotes from various teachers, a bunch of fun illustrations, and you can also get the first chapter completely free online at theembodimentbook.com. Enjoy, and back to the interview.
Cool. So what else should we talk about?
What else could we talk about? We could. I'm just coming back to, I think every yoga teacher can benefit from seeing a psychotherapist.
Yep. Yeah, no, I agree with you on that.
And having said that, Mark, there are some really awful psychotherapists.
Sure.
There are some not very good yoga teachers. So it's not like, oh, just go on. So one of the things I'm really into is like word of mouth and kind of getting recommendations. And it's something that kind of worries me sometimes. I lurk on social media to some extent, and I see people having these kind of conversations, and I'm like, wow, you know, you should have learned that, or you could have learned that on your yoga teacher training, and then you're having a conversation about that in a public forum.
Right. So
we
it's the idea
we
that
all need support. We all need help.
Let's talk about yin yoga a little bit. I kind of want to feel like I want to talk. We've been talking about the politics and the economics of yoga, which is important. It's one of the main reasons I brought you on, because I knew that you'd be interesting on that topic. Let's talk a little bit about yoga itself then. So we've not actually, I think, had a yin yoga teacher on the podcast.
Oh.
Yeah, so maybe you could say sort of briefly, what is yin yoga and why should anyone bother?
I really love yin yoga, and I first came across it after I've been practicing for probably about 8-10 years. And I first did a yin practice, autumn 2001 at Manchester Buddhist Centre. And for those who are listening who are unfamiliar with this practice, it's essentially slow, very slow. I sometimes call it extremely slow yoga. And it's a softer practice. So if someone says to me, well, all I do is yin yoga, I'd tell them to go and do legs, bums and tums. Or go run along the beach.
Exercise.
But it's about balance, Mark. And this is one of the points, that we live in a very outer balance world. And it's about, so these kind of qualities of yin and yang, so yin being softer and yang being kind of stronger, and yin being more inner, yang more outer. So it's kind of, with a yin yoga practice, we stay in the shapes for several minutes. We're on the ground. Maybe there's one standing pose, but it's just like slowing things down. I sometimes describe yin as a gateway drug for meditation, because I'll have people say to me, oh, I can't meditate. And I say, well, you just spent 5 minutes in a pose. And of course, we're all distracted. This is very natural, it's very human to get distracted. So there's a certainty of distraction, but then there is also the ability to come back. So in terms of like how we started, when you're talking about body awareness and being in the body. So I see a yin practice as being an avenue to being in the body in a slower and a softer way than a more dynamic practice.
Right. Yeah, what I definitely felt, okay, this is halfway house between yoga and meditation in the strong vinyasa type yoga. It's giving a lot to focus on. So it's forcing me to be present. And meditation is giving me very little to focus on. So I have to really work on being present until your knees hurt. You're basically, it takes quite a lot of coming back to the breath, coming back, or whenever the object is. Yeah, and yin is giving this middle ground of like, okay, something is happening. I'm sort of lying in a weird position, and there's a fair bit of sensation which might be a little challenging, but isn't awful. So I don't want to run away from it, but it's not so nice I get super attached to it. And it's giving a sort of nice middle ground, I thought.
It's this idea of what we're doing, because we're placing the body into a posture where the sensations will be stronger. That gives us more anchorage, and then helping us to be maybe more skillful, because if you're too yang in the yin, it's a car crash. So it's actually learning to be more gentle at the edge.
Yeah.
When we're in the vinyasa practice, we know that we're only going to be at the edge for perhaps 20 or 30 seconds at most. So they're in a way that can be more of a kind of almost like an aggressive engagement with that edge. But when we're doing a yin yoga practice, we're there for maybe 5 minutes. So we have to be more skillful. The number of times, though, that people have come up to me and said, oh, my first ever yin class, I have a list of I call it my first ever yin experiences. And people come up and say, that was really hard. Or I read an article that described doing yin yoga, their first ever yin yoga practice. They equated it to SAS interrogation techniques.
What's interesting is it's not so easy surrendering into intensity for several minutes, right? Like in some ways, there's the yang and the yin in this, right? It's not so easy to sit there and let go over a period of minutes.
We have to learn to soften.
Yeah.
And by that, Mark, I also mean we also have to be strong. So if we just soften, we'll be like a blancmange with no boundaries. But for so much of our lives, there is that kind of striving, driven energy. There's that kind of, it's almost like the defensiveness of modern life. We're walking around with like our arms crossed and like mentally we're building walls. Something I feel that can be really quite profound in a yin practice, and again, I'm not differentiating it from other forms. You can definitely experience this in other forms, is the parasympathetic nervous system. So that place where we can be more open and less closed, that place where we can be, I can hear you, rather than like you're saying something and I'm already planning what I'm going to say in response, and anyway, you're wrong.
And would you say that, how can I put this? yoga, modern posture yoga, as particularly it's done in the big cities, can actually just be about staying in that, parasympathetic fight, flight, jump around, get hot. Yeah. I mean, it's not taking people out of that. I mean, they might have an exhausted 2-minute shavasana at the end, but they're really spending an hour and a quarter practicing being more in fight or flight.
Exactly. I think there is that, you could say, the way sometimes it might be practiced is almost like sympathetic activation. Coming back to Bikram, so have you ever been to Bikram classes, Mark?
I refuse to go to any of his particularly, but I've been to a hot yoga studio that was based on his style but had sort of split off. So I've never been to a Bikram TM, Mark, but I've been pretty similar ones, yeah.
I've done like 2 or 3 Bikram classes. So the room is hot. You start with some fast breathing, and then you move around quickly. You get covered with sweat, and then you lie down. Kind of, what does that remind you of? It's like sex, isn't it?
Oh yeah, no, I see the combination, hot and sweaty, and then
and then you lie down.
You smoke a cigarette at the end. That should be
That's what they could do. That could be you could suggest that, Mark. But so no wonder people come back. Having said that, some good friends of mine have done Bikram or hot yoga for many, many years and have found it really helpful. So I'm definitely not, throwing the baby out with the bathwater. But there can be an element in these practices of, it's like, well, that's the addictive nature of like, it's like, we could call it orgasm yoga.
There's definitely that endorphin hit. And first time I went to a hot yoga class, my first thought was, oh my God, this hot? I knew it'd be warm, but I thought it'd be warm like like doing yoga in Spain in the shade. This was like doing yoga in the desert. It was really very hot. And then I just thought, I'm just going to not get to breathe. Why? And the first 10 minutes are going, this is hell. Why does anyone like this? And then by the end of it, I just had a absolutely, someone who's done drugs before, I was like stoned endorphin hit from what I would now regard as overstretching. And I was utterly like blissed out. And also I was able to completely let go of a lot of tension just through utter exhaustion. Yeah. And I thought, wow, it's not sophisticated. It's maybe not wise, but I could definitely see the attraction of it.
And that idea, just coming back to sustainability, it's to kind of have that kind of highs. And I remember this from my kind of drug days in the 1980s. You're chasing the high, and the high gets less over time, and the downs get more.
It gets diminishing returns. Interestingly, I go to 12-step meetings, and I have seen a number of people in 12-step get into hot yoga and then talk about it in 12-step as a sort of secondary addiction. And sometimes I'm thinking, well, it's better that you went back to that than crack.
Exactly.
It's sort of like it's a better addiction. But actually, normally they quit after a few months if they're in sobriety because they recognise it as an addiction. And not I'm not using the word addiction as a metaphor. I mean a physiological, actual chemical addiction, and they actually quit because their commitment is to sobriety. And once you've got sober from one thing, you sort of I've developed a bit of a caffeine addiction just the last month, and I really don't like it because having been sober from one thing,
I can restrict myself to one a day.
Right. I can't do one a day. It's 10 or none. So I kind of go.
That's psychological insight, Mark.
that's how addicts are, but we're not half a shandy before bed kind of people, but I don't like that addiction, and I will be breaking it over December because it's like you recognize an addiction once you've done an addiction and seen how much harm it can cause. You don't want another one, even if it's a bit more benign.
I was going to say, Mark, it's just as a little plug when we're talking about Bikram, have you come across a book called Hellbent?
I have heard of that, actually. Yeah, that's a book about people doing hot yoga, right?
Yeah, I'd highly recommend it to people who are listening. So Hellbent is by Benjamin Law, and he's a journalist, so he writes really well. And he's got this beautiful subtitle, which is something like Pain, Obsession, and the Search for Something Like Transcendence Through Competitive Yoga. And he gets really into Bikram, and he gets very kind of obsessed by Bikram. And he meets, he does a training with Bikram, and he meets Mr. Bikram. And at the end of the book, he has this chapter on narcissistic personality disorder. And he says, in his opinion, Mr. Bikram ticks like 14 out of the 16 boxes.
Wow. Yeah. And I wonder if he started that way, or the position of just sort of, this sort of it's interesting because you're, quite a lefty, Norman, but you've chosen a job that is a totalitarian job. You like, and actually, interestingly, recently I had a picture of me walking down 2 straight lines of people doing warrior pose. And one of my colleagues who's got an eye for these things said, you can't use that picture. And it reminds me of a Nazi photographer. And they sent me a picture, and it was Hitler and Mussolini and one other person walking down the middle of German warriors, in that case, soldiers. They weren't in warrior pose. And it was and I was walking down the middle of the studio, and it had a very slight, now I think my friend was being a bit sensitive to point this out. They had a certain trauma sensitivity, should we say. But I could see what they were saying. And it did remind me that there is potentially a sort of almost totalitarian, fascist quality to telling people how to sit and stand and breathe.
So, a question is, how do we take ourselves off those kind of pedestals, Mark? By the way, I don't know if you know this, but there was actually a campaign in the early 1930s for the Nazis to adopt yoga as the national sport.
They were quite into it, actually, I heard. Yeah, there was... they were into a few sort of Eastern esoteric things, and they were quite keen on the idea. Yeah, I heard that.
But it's a good, and so that's great feedback from your friend. But
I wasn't going for that look, but it just had that resonance somehow for her, and I think it wasn't just me. I think that could be almost any yoga class can have that resonance.
Oh, absolutely. But it's this thing of like, how do we take ourselves off these pedestals, and also being conscious of the imagery that we use. So using a kind of, a photograph, in flattering light, with people staring doe-eyed up at us is like, complete no-no.
Right. Because that's the image of the guru, the image of the better than, the above where you are kind of guru image. Yeah.
So, for me as a teacher, one of the current phrases I've been using a lot actually is about encouraging autonomy and emphasizing consent. And through that, then this idea that I talked about a little bit earlier of like empowerment.
So how do you do that? Let's be specific. So it might be, for example, saying, hey, do this pose, or maybe this pose if you prefer, like giving options, not punishing people for not doing exactly what you say. I mean, what are the specific ways you do that?
So one of the things, and I'll say very clearly, that say if someone goes to a yoga class and the teacher never says words like if, maybe, and perhaps,
right,
leave.
That is can you say that again, Norman? Because that's fucking gold dust. That's really clear.
If the teacher never uses words like if, maybe, perhaps, then leave. Leave sooner rather than later.
Because they are the words that show that someone isn't a fascist.
Yeah.
Right? Like, do this, if that, not for everyone. Maybe do this. Perhaps, in this case, that shows that there's a consideration for difference.
And it's interesting because it kind of touches a bit on what you talked earlier about the swamp. But one of my aspirations is to teach what you might describe as permissive yoga, which is people permission to experience postures as themselves rather than something being imposed upon them from outside. There's a point about if you ask a teacher, is there a way of varying this pose? Is there a way this pose could be done differently? And the teacher says no, then leave.
Then leave again. So if they're not, even because I think it's valid for a teacher to say, hey, I'm showing this one thing. But it's when you say, is there an alternative? And if they say no, that's when you worry. Because you can't always teach 10 different variations, right?
And also to teach 10 different variations gets too confusing. So just as a technique in my own teaching, I only teach 3 options. And I would give the easiest option first. Because if I say 10 options, people are that's too much information.
Right. Overload.
But then if I give 3 options and then I see someone in the class who perhaps needs something else, I'll go over and have an individual conversation with them. I remember I was teaching a retreat in Crete a couple of years ago, and someone was on there. She said to me, "Oh, you're teaching prop option yoga." And I was like, "What's that?" And she said, "Plenty of props and plenty of options." And it's also about revealing that we're human, Mark.
Yeah.
We make mistakes. I talked about this, what I said on Saturday. I was a bit like, oh, God, why did I say that?
Come on, I want to hear let's hear the details. What did you say? How bad was it?
No, I'm not going to say. But it was a mistake. And it was this, I just got carried away with my own chat. And then it's like, oh, no, I didn't need to say that. But to reveal that we are human, as much as, so for a yoga teacher to talk about injuries they might have experienced. I'm pretty confident that every yoga teacher will have had at least an injury through practicing yoga or maybe being assisted in a yoga pose. I've injured myself when I assisted someone in a yoga pose. You know, these things happen. I've had people say, but you're a yoga teacher, how can you be injured? I'm like, actually, it makes it more likely you're going to be injured. A difficulty when teaching yoga is, unfortunately, a lot of people learn more visually than, say, through hearing. So when you're teaching a beginner's class, you have to demonstrate a lot. And that puts a lot of stress on the body.
Well, just all the demoing.
Yes, yeah. In an ideal world, as a teacher, it's like minimize or do no demoing. So when I'm teaching like an intermediate Ashtanga class, I don't need to demo because people know the poses, know the sequence. But when we're teaching beginners, unfortunately, my understanding of how people learn is more people learn through seeing than hearing.
Just learning style thing.
It's a learning, yes, just the way we're wired.
See monkey do.
Yeah, this is my kind of understanding of.
Actually, I do an experiment on this, Norman, where I tell people to touch their knees while touching my elbows, and 90% of people touch their elbows. So 90% of people prioritize their eyes over their ears.
Yes. Yeah, that's a great example, Mark. I like that.
Yeah, it's a fun game to play, talking about embodiment and how non-verbal communication is really important. And, and unless people have really been meditating first and they're really present, like that's nearly always the case. But,
and we both know how hard it is to be really present.
Right, yeah, to be present to like even something as obvious as a completely different body part being instructed than the one that's shown.
We live in such stimulated times, and it's interesting for me. I'm reflecting. Yeah. I only realized very recently we're on the verge of a new decade.
The 20s. Yeah, we're back to the 20s.
The roaring 20s. And I kind of wonder, this decade that we've been in some ways, there's been this facade of connection through social media.
Yeah.
But the reality is actually disconnection.
Right.
I wonder if maybe we're starting to see some shift towards realizing actually we need connection, we need face-to-face interaction, which is one of the beautiful things about something like Buddhafield, or coming along to a yoga class, rather than practicing online.
The Embodiment Conference, which is online next year, one of our things is making it the Embodiment Decade. And one of the things I realized we needed to do was use the online conference to connect people personally, so that people coming to the conference can not only get some information and go online, but they can also find people. We're having some clever software do this, find people in their local area that they can actually connect with in embodiment groups face to face, because we've realized there's no substitute for that. And for me, rather than demonizing the online, that actually realizing that it has its place. And I agree with you, people are seeing both its strengths and its limitations now, when at first only the strengths were apparent. And also back to your argument about access, that I realize as well that there are a lot of people who can't get to a class because they're disabled or carers, or they just can't afford
celebrities.
Right. So I'm really seeing the advantages of online as well as face to face, and I think how they sort of interact skillfully becomes the next thing.
But it's not an either or.
Right.
As you know, I use online stuff. I've got classes online. I use Facebook. I have a newsletter. All these kind of ways of staying in touch with people. But I think as we live in very interesting times with all that's going on. And I think it's about, well, how can we connect with each other? How can we hear each other's points of view?
Mm-hmm.
How can we avoid looking down and blaming other? So this is something, there's a lot of demonizing of people, whether it's demonizing of the immigrant, whether it's demonizing of the person who voted the way you didn't vote in, the referendum, whether it's demonizing because you don't do the right kind of yoga.
Right, the yoga heretics.
Say again?
The yoga heretics.
Yoga heretics. I'm very proud to be a yoga heretic. But it's like to recognize what we have in common, our commonality. And as human beings, we're in some ways, I think we're skating on very thin ice. And this is a time for us to really take responsibility for our actions and to really wake up to our relationship with ourselves and with each other.
Norman, this is lovely. I think that's a nice place to end it. I do recommend your classes to people. So if I lived in North London, I'd definitely be a restorative class on a regular basis. It's really the, despite your socialist roots, it's the Bentley of restorative yoga. It's a luxurious, full prop experience with care from the heart as well as all the kit. So I recommend that to anyone. And if you get a chance to see Norman at a yoga festival like Buddhafield, for example, then you'll get another taste. In terms of finding you online, is it yogawithnorman.co.uk? Am I remembering that right?
Yes, thank you. And I have a monthly newsletter. So if you'd like to read my thoughts about life and the modern world and modern yoga and keep up to date with what I'm doing, then contact me through the website.
I look forward to you bursting into a posh yoga class with a red flag.
Red and black flag.
So red and black. Sorry, I forgot the poor anarchists. Okay, Norman, I really enjoyed this. The hour's gone by so quick. I need to go eat some dinner. I'm pretty hungry, so I'm going to leave it there. Norman, a pleasure as ever. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care, Mark.
Some ways to get more, to give back, and to get more involved now. So the biggest request I have would be to share the podcast with your friends, people that you think would really enjoy it. Email it to them, put it on your social media, tell them about it, old school. Really appreciate that. Equally, if you want to support us financially, you can go to Patreon. That's patreon.com/embodiment podcast and give us $1 an episode. And I'd say they're well worth $1. So that's less than £1 if you're in UK-ish. So yeah, please go there. On the embodifacilitator.com website is where this is hosted. Most people I think listen to for iTunes. iTunes, we'd certainly appreciate a review. The way iTunes works means that a review means more people will find it. iTunes regards it as more important for searches. So even a couple of sentences review really does help as a little thank you to us. And if you want to go to embodifacilitator.com, you can see the actual, links to the sites. There's comments on there. The Facebook group tends to be where people discuss things. So if you go to put in the Embodiment Podcast into Facebook, there's a page which is relatively quiet and a group which does have some discussion on. So I will reply to things personally there. So also on embodifacilitator.com website, there's all sorts of freebies there. There's videos, there's free ebooks, there's ebooks you can buy. And of course, there's our newsletter list. If you want to stay in touch and learn about things like the Embodied Facilitator course and our next Embodied Yoga Principles teacher training, then go to that website and you'll see a little pop-up and you can get the newsletter through there. Okay, so I think they're the main ones. Tell your friends, pay us some money on Patreon, give us a review on iTunes, send us your email if you want to be on the newsletter list, and get involved on the Facebook there. Bit long. Pick whatever you like that works for you. Until next time, welcome home to the body.